How could Jesus tempt himself in the wilderness with ruling over the nations if he did not possess them and he didn't have a right to them himself?
Well, I believe that Jesus did have the power to do that. Even on the cross, he said that he could call to 12 legions of angels to deliver him. So I think it's a very clear instance of Jesus being tempted to use his power given to him by God, to subdue the nations. Now, the bottom line with the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness is, regardless of whether or not we believe it's a supernatural evil Satan, the point is everything that the Satan had said to him had to be literally tempting to Jesus himself. Otherwise, there would have been no temptation. It would have been a farce. And from that point of view, if it was tempting to Jesus, then he could have done it. Otherwise, there's no point in asking him to do it.
The Satan, and we don't drop the article very carefully, the one well-known Satan said to him, if you are the Son of God, which you are, he didn't say, let's imagine you may be. If you are in fact the Son of God, why don't you do so and so? And Jesus answered him with scripture. He said, the Bible tells me I mustn't do that.
Jonathan, can you provide a brief exegesis of Jude 9? It is clear that Michael is the archangel Michael. The body of Moses is the body of the prophet Moses. Satan is clearly an individual, not a group, and is presented as Michael, as an external supernatural being, not a group of Samaritans or other apostate Jews during the time of Ezra or Joshua.
I mean, the first point I'd like to make is that there's a whole raft of assumptions which have been smuggled into that question. It is apparently clear X, Y, Z. I think that needs to be established before the question can even be addressed. The fact that the person mentions this is a citation of Zechariah, and they actually mention that they don't believe it's saying the same thing as Zechariah, means that they're totally aware of alternative interpretations and are choosing not to accept them. I think that needs to be dealt with first. Since Jude is clearly referring to Zechariah 3, we need to look at Zechariah 3. Otherwise, we can't simply smuggle in references which aren't in the text. So from that point of view, that's what I think needs to be dealt with first. I don't see an issue with that, especially if you go back to Zechariah 3. I don't see a problem with one, especially in a vision, with one person being representing an individual and another person in a vision representing a group or something else, or an impersonal or another non-supernatural being. I mean, you'd be aware, of course, that in Zechariah 3, a number of the rabbis interpreted this as not referring to a supernatural evil being. Of course, in the Qumran literature, we have an interpretation of the Satan in Zechariah 3 as the evil inclination, and later rabbis interpreted either as the enemy of the Jews, or the like Sanballat and other local enemies, or as the community of opposers of Zechariah, or of course as the evil inclination. The first thing that has to be established is that all those things that the questioner said are clear or are obvious actually have to be first addressed and demonstrated to be obvious. Secondly, the questioner really has to address Zechariah 3, which currently they're avoiding.
Richard Balcom, by the way, who's a very good scholar on the Word Biblical Commentary on Peter and Jude. This is a reference to the Assumption of Moses. It's a non-biblical book, but it is inscripturated. It's given truth by the fact that Jude cites it. And there's a story there that's found, it's quite known, that the devil had a fight over the body of Moses, meaning the body of Moses. And that's a well-established story in the Assumption of Moses. Check it with any Bible dictionary. Use the great Bible dictionaries like Hastings and so on as your first line of resource. Hard to get to a theological library. Difficult to do any of this well if you don't have access to a theological library. So you need to be a little bit conscious of one's limitations. But Balcom deals with all this well in his book on Revelation, his commentary on Revelation, I think.
The problem is, of course, that text, the Assumption of Moses, and it has actually not been found, especially predating the Christian era. So it's not actually clear, and the scholars acknowledge it's not actually clear what Jude is citing here, but we do know there is a very clear reference, which everyone acknowledges, to Zechariah. I think that should be the starting point.
For John as well, please explain Satan being cast down to the earth and by whom.
Okay, well, this is actually something I'd very much like to know. Exactly when was Satan cast down to the earth and by whom? If this is citing a Bible passage, then I can assume it's citing Revelation 12, which I already addressed. The dragon there, as Malcolm and Beale acknowledge, is Rome, and the passage in Revelation 12 is a symbolic description of the pursuit of the body of Christ by Rome and Jesus' eventual deliverance of his saints. And that's the context. The symbolic representation of the casting down of Rome is Jesus defeating the apocalyptic beast of Rome.
Milton is a great deal of trouble. So I should have said earlier on, I do not subscribe to the orthodox doctrine of Satan in many respects. So this is a reference to the future, because when Satan is cast to the earth, into the earth, by the way, then he knows he has in a short time to go. And that's 1260 days, which is the final half of the final septad of years. So that's the whole prophecy thing there, but it's not what Milton said. No evidence of him being cast out of heaven in Genesis. I don't see that. So I'm not espousing the orthodox doctrine in many respects.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that too, Anthony. And I know your funnily enough, your belief on Satan and demons is actually surprisingly closer to Christadelphian in a number of respects. And I really appreciate you identifying that too. Yeah.
Sir Anthony, why does Acts 5:3 say Satan filled Ananias's heart, but the next verse says Ananias conceived the thought himself?
Well, because both things are true. If you look at the whole Bible evidence, it is not true to say that sin equals the Satan. It's not true. So it's perfectly reasonable. Filling the heart, it comes from the Satan outside. That's not a difficulty for our point of view, as I see it.
I think it's pretty clear. As I've said before, the parallelism is very clear. And when we have a look at Paul and James and other New Testament writers describing the process of Satan, they say the process of temptation, it starts in the heart. I agree that Satan is not sin. As I said before, a common understanding in the New Testament era was that the evil inclination, or the evil imagination as it is in Genesis 6, was by that time referred to as Satan, or the Satan, or even the devil, the Diabolous, a development that happened in the intertestamental era. So I see the parallelism here as particularly strong for the reasons I stated previously.
The Greek for the evil one is ho paneros, and the Hebrew word is usually translated as Satan. With this, can John elaborate on his belief that Satan did not exist in the Old Testament?
Okay, yeah, and previously I mentioned that Satan is in the New Testament as a human Satan, and also in the form of an angelic opposer. Okay, so the question is the Greek for evil one, ho paneros, and the Hebrew word usually translated as Satan. Okay, now, as I mentioned previously, that ho paneros doesn't actually have any pre-Christian witness as a reference to a supernatural evil being, particularly one called Satan. When we find it used as the evil one in the New Testament, we don't actually have any merit for viewing it as something that was a term which was used to refer to a supernatural evil being. As I demonstrated, on the other hand, we do find rabbinic witnesses talking of the evil one, and even speaking to the evil one as the evil inclination to sin within people. Now, with regard to the Hebrew word usually being translated Satan, that's something I've already dealt with previously. The point is that the word Satan in the Old Testament is not used as a proper name, and there's a fairly strong consensus on this. In summary, Breitenbach says, in summary, the 4 Hebrew Bible texts that mention a celestial Satan are probably datable to the 6th century BC or later. It's not clear that the Satan envisioned in Zechariah 3. It is clear that the Satan in Zechariah 3 is not the same being as in Numbers 22. Likewise, moreover, in none of the 4 texts is Satan indisputably used as a proper name. Likewise, Dresden says it was not until the 2nd century BCE that, because of outside pagan influences, the Yetzer, the evil inclination, was first conceived as an independent evil force with a sinister mind of its own. Referring to Lincoln, Satan makes only 3 appearances in the Old Testament, and in none of these is he defined as a cosmic adversary. He's either a human opponent, or he is the God's obedient angelic servant. That is why Tate says that no passage in the Old Testament has to do with Satan or the devil in the sense of later literature and Christian theology. And in that sense, there is no Satan in the Old Testament. Not to say that there is no adversary, but there is no Satan in that sense. Likewise, Wolf says that contrary to popular thinking for the ancient Israelites, this figure was not the personification of evil that came much later. Likewise, Derek Brown makes the point that the Satan, the Diabolous in the Old Testament, doesn't always refer to the same person. So just the fact that the definite article isn't referring to one individual person or being who's referred to all the time. The main passages which were later read as referring to the Satan probably did not originally refer to this figure, and there is no single Satan figure of the Old Testament.
Well, the audience is put into a difficult position here because there's a massive amount of dictionary and commentary evidence to the exact opposite of what was said there. I would argue that in Chronicles, Satan, without the article, is a proper noun. So the notion that it is generally conceded that Satan is never a proper name is contradicted by masses of scholars. I don't want to say that because it puts the audience and the public into a difficult position.
I think it's important that there is actually a massively greater scholarly consensus now that the Satan in the Old Testament is definitely not that later Christian development. Even in standard Bibles like the New English Translation, in light of usage elsewhere, the adversary in 1 Chronicles 20 verse 1 is likely a human adversary, probably a nearby nation. Likewise, the Jewish Study Bible, many scholars have understood the Satan to refer to the infamous heavenly being, but it is more likely that it here refers to a human adversary. Yep. Likewise, Hicks quotes a range of scholars who believe that Satan here is a human adversary and points that there is no evidence that the noun is a proper name here. And there is a host of evidence here, and you can look at plenty of commentaries and Bible dictionaries.
Well, if I had a PowerPoint, I would simply say those as contradicted by just as many scholars. So I'll leave the public to deal with that. But certainly, however you take Satan without the article, it doesn't mean human nature. That whole idea of being the evil incarnation has been imported from Judaism. It's not in Scripture. So we went outside the Bible there and talked a different language.
It says, please comment on God's conversation with Satan and Job.
Yes, well, that's very interesting. There was somebody called the devil there who had a conversation with God. And you cannot have a conversation with a personification. So that's the end of that argument. It doesn't work. You don't converse with wisdom. Wisdom doesn't talk back to you. There's no parallel whatsoever. So nobody, as far as I know, in commentary is going to tell you that was a personification. Don't think it works.
I agree with Anthony. I don't think it was a personification either. The point here is that there are varying views among scholars as to what this Satan was. But of course, they agree that it was not the Satan of later Jewish and Christian theology. So David Hines says that we note first the definite article appears before the term at the end of each of its occurrence in the book of Job. This fact prevents us from identifying the figure of the Satan with the Satan of later Jewish and Christian theology. Victor Matthews, in his commentary, likewise says that the word Satan here can be used of human beings or supernatural beings, even the angel of the Lord. And he says that the term does not take on the role of a personal name until the 2nd century BCE. Likewise, Hartley, in his commentary on the book of Job, says in Job it functions as a title rather than as a personal name, and the Satan may be the prosecuting attorney of the heavenly council, in other words, an obedient angel. I'm quite happy with the idea that this was a member of the sons of God in terms of the Hebrew community of worshippers, and that one of them was a jealous human. Okay. It's very important to note that throughout the book of Job, as several commentators note, Francis Anderson, for example, in the subsequent discussions, here I'm quoting Francis Anderson, the misfortunes of men are never traced to a diabolical foe, and it is impossible to believe that the purpose of this tremendous book is to teach us an explanation of evil that Job and his friends never think of, namely that human suffering is caused by the devil. Now, why doesn't Job or his friends or anybody else in the book of Job ever seem to understand that everything is being caused by a supernatural evil being called Satan here? The evil, even in the text, is only ever attributed to God, and nobody demonstrates any understanding of the supernatural evil being here called Satan. And of course, the Satan disappears after chapter 2.
You notice what Jonathan there said. It wasn't until the 2nd century BC that Satan became a proper name, but it did become a proper name. And I agree with him. I'm not going to use the argument from Job, but by the 2nd century BC, the Satan was a proper noun, and that's a person and not a personification.
Anthony, could you please give an example of any possession account where a demon spoke?
I've not experienced that. The nearest I came to it in Africa was there was a man we met in Africa. I've been in Malawi many times, and this gentleman seemed to know our names before we told him. Now, it could have been a trick, I don't know. But I have no personal experience of exorcism. The demon spoke in the Gospels all the time. We know that because of the grammatical agreement between demonia, which is neuter, and the verb speaking. It's much more obvious if you're reading the Greek. And that's difficult. I don't want to say that, really. But get some consultation with the Greek speaker. And you couldn't, if you wanted to say the demons are not the demoniac, you couldn't say it more clearly than they do.
This question I want to bring up because I think sometimes people misunderstand. If the devil is real, I can blame him for all the wrong I have done.
No, honestly, even I disagree with that. Even if it was real, supernatural evil being, you can't do that, because anybody who believes in an evil supernatural being also understands that human beings have personal volition. At least most of us do. So I don't think that's valid either. Sorry, Anthony.
I totally agree with him. Absolutely agree with him. Don't ever say the devil made me do it. That is absolutely false and dangerous and wrong.
I think that's a potential danger of this belief, but it's by no means a corollary.
I agree with that.
So Lori Jane says, so a bunch of people in the day just went around faking having a demon, and Jesus rebuked the person then?
As I mentioned previously, I don't think that. I think that these people were generally suffering from some kind of illness. I cited, for example, Dunn and Twelftree, who said that in cases such as Mark 9, we need to understand that the person was suffering from a mental illness or some other disorder, and that the people of the day, people around them, did not understand that mental disorder, and so attributed it wrongly to a demon. I don't think that Jesus rebuked the person. I think the gospel writers are giving us a description of the event which makes sense to the people at the time. Likewise, for mature Christians, John completely omits any reference to this. Those kind of beliefs are no longer necessary anymore. And I think it's a great example of how the New Testament writers and the earliest Christians demythologized these beliefs.
Yeah, I want to simply say that Jesus is being outed very severely on that answer, because in Mark 5:8, Jesus had been saying to the man, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." If that's not addressing a person, I don't know what would be. "You deaf and mute spirit, I command you, come out of him and do not enter him again." Jesus is obviously subscribing to the current idea of demon possession. But
if the demon can't hear him, there's not much point in speaking to the demon. So I think that Jesus is aware he's not really speaking to the demon, even though the person who is unwell thinks he might be. The demon obviously can't hear him. So I don't think Jesus is actually speaking to a demon who can't hear.
So why does the text say that he spoke to the deaf and mute spirit?
I've addressed this previously as part of my accommodation argument.
Yeah, it's the accommodation argument. We simply reject the idea. He's tongue in cheek. And that is a very serious. Okay.
Anthony, how can angels sin if they cannot die? The wages of sin is death.
Well, who said angels can't die? Good angels cannot. It's complete muddle of categories. We know that angels who are given immortality, they're given the power to go on living, are doing fine. But there are little matter of angels who sin. And Christadelphians have to get rid of all that language. So I recommend you don't do it. You cannot just say, well, an angel means a sinful person or not. No, that's not right. No commentary known to me, and I haven't read them all, would dare to say that the angels who sinned didn't mean the angels who sinned. So you're up against the entirety of scholarship on that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think that I would need very clear evidence in the Bible that angels can sin, not that there are two categories of angels, angels which can sin and angels which can't sin. Anthony knows that in the Old and New Testament, the word angels is used of mortal beings who are servants of God. And I believe that that's the context of the angels who sinned.
Can I leave the public with this? The B'nai Elohim in Genesis 6, that exact expression always doesn't mean human beings. So you've got to tackle that extraordinary story there and not just get rid of it, because those words do have meaning. That particular expression never means other than angels, and the category difference is clear. There are people of Elohim interacting with human females. That's a devastatingly awful story, but it's referred to rather massively in Peter and Jude.
John, can you deal with Luke 8:30? Jesus asking for a personal name and the impersonal replying with a name.
Jesus asked him, that is the man, what is your name? And the man said Legion, because many demons had entered him. So the man is addressed, not the demon, and the man replies, not the demon.
Well, that might be true of that story, but it will not work in all the stories. You must have a principle that's going to work everywhere. There are other stories where the demon is distinguished from, and actually John has admitted that. He said there are cases where it isn't distinguished, but you've got to deal with the cases where they are carefully distinguished.
So for John, what happened in John 17:23?
Can I just mention one thing on the previous question in Luke 8:32? I read the New American Standard Version. There was a herd of many swine feeding there on the mountain, and the demons, I read, implored him to permit them. Guess what? That them is the demons. So Jesus was talking to the demons there. And the NASV inserts the word demons there correctly. And he gave them, the demons, permission, not the man. Clear distinction.
Sir Anthony, why does Paul in 1 Corinthians 8:4-10 infer that it should be okay to eat sacrifices to demons, except that a weaker brother who believes in other gods might see it, if in fact demons actually exist?
Well, you have to remember, first of all, that Paul said that we don't want you to have fellowship with demons. Fellowship with human nature? Obviously not. Fellowship with demons. And it's all right to go to dinner and not ask about whether the food's been offered to an idol, if your conscience will allow it. Perfectly reasonable. But the fellowship is with demons, Paul said. I don't want you to have fellowship, koinonia, with demons. What's that? Human nature? I don't think so. It doesn't work language-wise for me.
If someone has schizophrenia, bipolar, or Tourette syndrome, how can you distinguish them from being possessed?
I can't. I don't know. I'm not in that business. I don't do exorcisms. If I did it as a full-time job, I think I might learn. I don't know. I'm talking about the Bible. I'm talking about what Jesus believed and what the New Testament presents us, and they knew the difference. I don't. So what?
I think that this demonstrates dramatically the utility of the belief in demons. It's a solution looking for a problem, and there are, in fact, problems which aren't solved by it. The point is that in the New Testament period, Jews who did believe in demons treated exorcism as the first response. Christians these days, even when they do believe in demons, typically regard demon exorcism as the last resort.
Yeah.
So most of the time, even people who do believe in a supernatural, even evil, Satan, demons, go to doctors first. They certainly try everything scientific before they resort to what, for the first century Jews, was the first response.
Rephaim translated as spirits of the dead living under the earth, human or non-human?
Well, they're just simply the empty, non-living spirits. I mean, they're considered non-persons. I mean, they don't exist. If the question is actually what the Rephaim are, then that's another question. But I'm not sure if the question is asking if they're supposed to be demons. I don't think they're regarded as demons. They're not actually living. I don't think that the spirits here are living beings. I don't think they're described as living in the under the earth at all. So I'm not sure exactly what the question is getting at.
Yeah, I can answer that one on 1 Peter 3. Jesus, when he was raised from the dead, in that spiritual condition, went and preached to the spirits in prison. He wasn't preaching to non-existent. He certainly wasn't preaching to dead humans. You can't preach to a dead human. We're agreed on that. He was preaching to the spirits who had been evil in the day of Noah. You can't say they don't exist. He didn't go preaching to nobody.
That sounds like immortal souls to me.
Septuagint translation of Job 1-2 and Zechariah 3 renders Hasatan and Ho Diabolous.
Yes.
Is this the main source of the technical term to Ho Diabolous that occurs dozens of times in the New Testament?
We've dealt with that, I think. Well, go ahead, yes.
Well,
As I've mentioned before, the Old Testament doesn't have a single Satan or Diabolos. The point is that, as I've cited from the literature previously, the Satan, even the Satan and the Diabolos in the Old Testament is never the same person all the time. And
Right.
and even Anthony would agree with
I would
this.
agree with that. Yeah.
So as I said, I cited Derek Brown previously, saying that there is no single Satan figure of the Old Testament. So I'm not sure exactly what the question is getting at here. The main source of the technical term, Diabolous, the New Testament uses these terms in the same way as the Old Testament, insofar as it's not always the same referent. That's it.
No, I agree with that entirely. But of course, it's never the internal human nature, ever. I fully agree. You can have a Satan, you can have a donkey who is a Satan. That is good information. But on the other hand, no case does Diabolos or Hasatan mean internal, non-personal sin. Never.
So I understand Legion had a personality issue, but why did Jesus involve the pigs when he cast them out?
Because I believe the man was being accommodated. The man who was mentally ill was being accommodated, and Jesus was giving him a visual demonstration of how he was cured. I think it's that simple. We agree that everybody agrees that this man was mentally ill, and I think Jesus was accommodating him in that regard and speaking to him in a way that the man would understand. And we even know that even Luke tells us that after this man was in his right mind. There's no doubt that the man was mentally ill, and I think Jesus spoke to him compassionately in that regard.
Yeah, that's a theory of accommodation, which from my point of view has been imposed on the text. That comes from outside.
I
It could well
understand
be
that.
true.
Yeah, I understand your view there.
Yeah, you can see that's one of the, and you're not saying that there aren't some difficulties with both points of view.
Oh no, I
Otherwise,
know. It's, I mean, they're
know.
neither of them are a perfect fit, but I really do
Right.
think that this is a better fit for most of the
Yep.
passages.
And the etymology of the term or diabolos, which is a sort of striking through word, not the concept of the devil. We've agreed happily that the devil of the New Testament, as I see it, is not there clearly in the Old Testament.
Yeah, again, I'm not sure what the point here is. Hot diabolos is a term used in the Greek Old Testament, as Anthony and I both agree, and we both agree it's not always the same reference.
We'll leave it at that. The last one I'm going to bring up is from a good friend, so we're going to let her ask her. So Michelle says, 1 Peter 5:8, who is prowling around like a lion to deceive us?
Yes.
If you would answer that, John, and we'll give Anthony, and we'll be done with questions after that then.
Sure, I think it's referring to the opponents of Christ, particularly the Roman state. The image here is taken from a range of passages such as Jeremiah 50:17 and 50:34 to 38. There's also the roaring lion passage in Psalm 22:13. And the figure of the lion to describe Israel's opponents is also found in the Qumran texts. So I think this is just a standard literary trope of a figure of an opponent. In this case, the opponents of Christianity, particularly the Roman state.
The definition of Satan seems to have changed a bit. We started by saying it's a personification, not a person. Now it's the Roman Empire. In fact, from a Christadelphian point of view, every human being is Satan. So
I just want to point out that in my opening slide, I did make the point that Satan is not only a personification, and I made a specific point of saying in the Old Testament, there are human adversaries, human Satans, and even an angelic adversary. So the Satan and Diabolus are not simply a personification, as we've agreed. They're used in a variety of different contexts with slightly different meanings.
And the Roman Empire too.
Yeah, and the Roman Empire too, because it's an adversary, just like the Satan adversary of an evil nation, an enemy nation, which was found in 1 Chronicles 21 and 2 Samuel 24. I might also make the point that a roaring lion walking around the street is a particularly bad metaphor for an invisible opponent that nobody can detect if, of course, this is referring to a supernatural evil being whose temptation are indistinguishable from human inner temptation. It's not a very good image for that.